What just happened? 13 years at UCA and all adjacent matters. This will be a long recording, but I enjoy the process, and it is also going to be available as a blog for people who like to look at words, like in Grandpa Simpson times. Intro. As the title implies, I felt compelled to reflect on the past 13 years, prompted by my imminent redundancy due to enormous staff cuts. This is where I've been working over that time frame. I've had various other jobs in addition to that within that time frame, but UCA has been the only constant, and therefore it does present a big timestamp that's impossible not to acknowledge in some way. I'm mindful not to attempt to condense everything into this. I don't think that would even be possible, but what I do intend to do is offer a perspective on how things have changed, with no particular bias or agenda, other than my own personal compulsion to process that length of time with some sense of closure and preserve it in some way before the repetitive tedium of life creeps back in. Memories grow more distorted and death inevitably comes for us all. I think that the nature of learning support jobs at places like UCA does objectively offer a unique perspective, especially having started there relatively young. The dynamic of the role somewhat exists at a halfway point between the students and the tutors, and so you get to witness how one lot acts when the other lot leaves the room. You observe how the tutors all differ in their approach with the students and how well that plays out or not. I shan't be using any specific names and will state right off the bat that most tutors I've got to work with go above and beyond in what they do. But like any self-respecting project brief in higher education, I will keep my words generously vague and ambiguous. This is just as well as it's hard for me to remember things clearly anyway. I have an incredibly scatty memory I can put largely down to my own neurodivergent learning differences, also perhaps some fallout from overuse of cannabis as a teenager, and more recently an accumulation of anxiety-induced inflammation manifesting into complications with liver and gut health, namely waves of compromised immunity, lots of those, and the bleak rollercoaster that has been long COVID, the latter of which likes to consume my physical and cognitive faculties whenever I get a free moment. Thankfully, those flare-ups have gotten less frequent lately, but recovery is a complex thing, especially given the COVID virus was just the spark that ignited an already leaking gas tank, for me anyway. I may have to touch on that later, because the first chapter of this journal thing, whatever you want to call it, is a very brief personal background for some subjective context as to what I was bringing to this work environment in the first place. Part 1. Me. From my previous experience with some assurance from counselling and psychotherapy in the past, I can say that for the most, if not all, my recollective life, I've had some compulsion to prove myself. By that I mean to defend or justify my actions in anticipation of being judged poorly or unfairly. My mind has long been consumed by how to present the best version of myself possible, and so avoid giving off any impression that isn't optimum. I won't attempt to unpack whatever the reasons are of why I've had this obsession. All I can say is I seem to have moved between different groups and different social circles numerous times since childhood, and all for different practical reasons incidental to me. But it contributes to this persistent anxiety of some outsider syndrome, acting as my own representative in most interactions under a lingering fear of alienating people, while not wanting to betray my own authenticity. So unlike some anxious people might be drawn to play it safe socially to fit in, my own social identity has played out like a creative project almost, one where everything is at stake to feel obliged to deliver something that's both unique and likeable at the same time. I hope it is clear why this would be relevant to touch on before any observations and reflections on my time at UCA, because 90% of all my interactions through life, personally and professionally, have fueled so much erratic internal analysis, both self and of the external world, which spirals and is the very reason why I end up writing these lengthy reflections, to alleviate all the time alone with my own relentless assessments of me and all adjacent matters. Despite this, in my own short-sighted efforts of stoic denial, I wasn't prepared to accept I may have a problem with anxiety until about 4 years ago. Prior to, I just interpreted those feelings simply as life, being a hostile and challenging place, and the only way out is to try harder. Fueled by that determination for constant self-improvement, years of exercise and nutrition conveniently tempered some of that anxiety, temporarily anyway. But even with those healthy habits, I would still frequently get sick, which I now see was because I just don't know how to relax. When I had time off, my mind would just fill it with more problems to solve. So, after years of belligerent determination to be better in my own perception and generally successful, it's not often it's felt like I've had much to show for it. And I'm not trying to be self-critical there. I see the efforts that I made, but when blinded by anxiety, I may have been looking for the right things in the wrong place. Positive and stimulating connections is what that all boils down to. And as a basic need, that seems in reflection that in my delusion, I believe the only way I could meet that need was by working harder, coaching myself in relative isolation until I was successful enough to enjoy life. In UCA, I have watched people rise to great creative success, and I've also seen people of far more modest success and circumstance find acceptance with their own peers and inner peace. And it's becoming evident that the events at UCA that stand out to me are defined by my own hysterically ambitious dysfunction. Part 1.1 BTEC National Diploma. One last precursor. My first interactions with UCA, which was until my second year still CAIAD, was on a BTEC in art and design. I learnt more valuable things in those 2 years creatively than the 3 subsequent years I spent on my BA in Brighton. I still miss that BTEC. I would love to do it again with the benefit of common sense I've subsequently learned about myself, but every aspect of my art practice throughout my whole adult life can be traced back to a few isolated epiphanies I had during that course. I can't pretend that some modest experiments with psychedelics and amphetamines didn't help kickstart a lot of those new processes, along with some really enthusiastic tutors who helped motivate and contextualize these new creative ideas and methods. There's only one drug I regret consuming quite so much during my BTEC. That's weed, which had its charm in low doses on isolated occasions, but generally was more of an anxious compulsion that spilled over from adolescence. I think what was significant about that time in relation to chemically altered states was the sense of freedom to do so, while still being underpinned by deadlines, targets, and a general purpose to make something valuable out of it all. Making friends there also opened the door to the free party scene locally, which had its own weird highs and lows, but defined where I positioned my own creative practice in a broader culture. Though I carried dormant anxiety I would not try to confront for many years later, the BTEC was as empowering a time as it could have been, and a certain section of drug culture was a significant part of it. Though keep in mind, I was always somewhat cautiously inclined even then, and would try these things with a level of restraint and precaution that most of my friends didn't. But it is interesting to me in reflection that some of the more altered states that I did reach gave me fleeting but vivid glimpses of a life without personal disdain and without self-sabotage. And while I couldn't manifest those experiences into lasting self-confidence at the time, it still flourished in my creative perceptions. I could share specific anecdotes about this course. I do miss my friends there a lot, but that would have to be a whole other reflection. I only wanted to touch on it this time, and I suppose when touching upon it, those altered states seem to be the thing that stood out in what remains of me today. Not everyone did drugs there, and the course was no more synonymous with psychedelics than any other art BTEC at the time, I imagine. Part 1, LSA. I started working at UCA in 2012, and with the scarcity of funds in universities these days, simply finding a job like that, especially through word of mouth, is sadly a thing of a bygone era. That's the first thing to note. Now, however, people could easily be queuing up around the block to apply for something of a similar pay with 10 times the workload. I'd already been working at a Sen secondary school, one that I had previously attended as a student. So after years of working as a lifeguard and an interest in developing good communication skills off the back of NLP and hypnotherapy courses, this line of work was already a welcome direction to pursue for me. The UCA job was simply a chance encounter with a friend of a friend who recommended it to me and mentioned me to their manager. Initially, that was one instance of good fortune in knowing the right person and being in the right place at the right time. And I know full too well from the blood, sweat, and tears I've poured into formal and unsuccessful applications for creative opportunities here and there, only to discover time and again these are tight-knit communities, and an awful lot of said close friends or relatives seem to get a foot in the door by default. It really is who you know, and in some cases now more than ever. Once again, now in redundancy, I've noticed that obstacle of being an outsider, trying with all honest efforts to get in the sought after jobs with a sustainable wage are those that many us mere mortals have to traverse. A marathon of bureaucracy and admin, interviews if lucky, just to receive a soulless email template declining said application. So, anyway, back in 2012, education still had a much bigger pot overall, where jobs like the one my friend put me through to at UCA even existed. No university I know of has been employing that high ratio of support staff for many years. Both roles that I've had at UCA have been phased out now, marked by some of many stages of dwindling resources that's played out across the country. I am grateful to that friend for making me aware of such a vacancy in the first place, as it was already as it transpired nearing the end of an era. A level of support resources that I don't think will be revitalising unless people start applying technology and innovation with more foresight and common sense. So anyway, I then had one unsuccessful interview at UCA before the then manager very kindly offered me feedback and a second attempt later that year. Between 2012 and 2018, my role there was as an LSA. Each of those academic years was different and unique, for better and worse, and that constantly shifting process brought up different strengths and weaknesses in me each year. Every year I'd been working one-to-one with only 1 to 2 students, all with their own specific needs and varying levels of maturity in their behaviour and motivations. A frequent question that always arises with some students is that while I have to give them the benefit of doubt, sometimes their willingness and engagement begs the question of if they actually want to be there, or were they or their parents or carers just assuming this would be a place to doodle some pictures and be left alone. It can be frustrating and can harbour some distrust when you suspect them to be lying about things, and therefore when their lack of willingness to work is escalated, and in their defensiveness and frankly desperation at times try to throw me under the bus for their lack of motivation. That was one of the harder parts of the job then. The other was students who would make a scene. often quite an alarming scene for all involved, leaving me to try and diffuse it. As someone who personally obsesses over always making a good impression and wanting to be respected, I avoid confrontation unless it's in a carefully worded and formal way. I also often hate it when people draw attention to me. So having people kicking off, screaming, crying, or yelling with rage about something in an environment full of restrained adults who are all now looking in my direction, I fucking hate it. Because of this, adrenaline became a familiar ally at times and during certain academic years. One has to maintain. There were, of course, also wonderful students, people who wanted help, and I felt privileged to be there rooting for them. I learnt to handle emotional fires, but when I could earn the students' confidence in me and establish a mutual respect, all the inevitable challenges of the job didn't matter. I suppose the more challenging students who didn't show much respect or goodwill was all still valuable experience. It is just unfortunate that some years that distrust and inevitable adrenaline became the norm, and on one particular year impacted me severely while other life matters were already keeping me on edge. That is just unfortunate, but all I can say is it was for a period a toxic combination of personal circumstance and myriad anxieties in the workplace. Naturally, I won't be going into details, but it's interesting how my time working in support roles has informed my interactions in personal life, sometimes to my detriment. When there's an impulse to remain passive and inclusive of people's needs or challenging behaviours without finding my way to maintain my own personal boundaries. That's my way of constructively saying that some people do abuse patience, politeness, and defying humility in very clever and sometimes manipulative ways, toxic ways that are very difficult to get out of without causing more problems. And when working in that part of education so many years, one is exposed to so much confrontational and challenging behaviour, it can make one more irritable in daily life without the space to vent about it. Respect and mindful consideration has been so essential in daily life. It's often a harsh readjustment when life presents you with people who function so exclusively on deceit, disrespect, and what I would call selective empathy. But then I've been spending most of my life telling myself to try harder. Whether or not I did so in the best context, I've always been susceptible to great frustration when encountering people who don't seem to invest any effort in anything that I consider such essential personal values. And I intend no grudges. I know that's a pointless thing to have. We all have flaws, and it's a messy life in trying to address how the big ones impact on the others. I'm just talking about me. It is rewarding to see a student use support change so dramatically over the time you spend with them. Those rewarding times are something I'm grateful for, as I know you'd be hard-pressed to find that satisfaction in many jobs. Feeling socially detached as I often was, it also provided a temporary sense of self-appreciation and belonging, which I didn't find very much in life outside of work. Most of my interactions and conversations on a weekly basis would be with students. It was ultimately the bulk of my social life, only detached by the boundaries of my role. It was the space I could feel belonging, self-value, purpose and appreciation in plentiful amounts. Then, soon after I'd get to know them, the course would end, they would move on, and I'd hit repeat the following September. As I've previously said, since childhood I seem to have frequently moved from one social circle to another, feeling therefore somewhat like a constant outsider, trying to build new roots, so it is unfortunate spending most of my weekly interactions with students on 1 to 2 year courses. Essentially, this job has potentiated that same ruminating outsider complex. And I still really miss talking with people, many of whom I haven't seen in a decade. It does make me reflect on why I'm still not in touch with people I studied with at college or uni. I don't honestly know why that is. I'm probably a lot more grounded in myself now, more humble and honest in how I communicate. But in a kind of tragic way, the annual cycle of 13 years of learning support at UCA has felt like a series of mock tests for a social life that didn't fully arrive. Make no mistake, I have friends that I value greatly. I'm grateful for that, and that is not my point. But I'm in my 30s now. It gets harder and harder to arrange socialising with anyone, let alone find the time to meet new people. This is just, as I've said, a reflection on the last 13 years of my life. My imminent departure at UCA is just the timestamp. It is the constant that I cannot reflect upon without my individual lens. I'm recalling this in no particular order other than designating 2 chapters per job role, splitting the 13 years somewhere in the middle. I think I don't have the inclination for fractions either. A formal account of 13 years would be nice, but I've accepted my scatty limitations, akin to my drawing methods, that really reached a coming of age during my BTEC at CAIAD and UCA, that I, as with this writing method it seems, would modestly describe as gestural intentions. Figuratively speaking, I don't do black and white thinking, even though my art practice is mostly monochrome and lots of fine lines. This reflects more on a desire for some clarity and certainty in life rather than some autistic compulsion. Wherever my neurodivergent differences actually land, I have to clarify my absolute lack of clarity. My experience of the world doesn't seem to run by partitions. Rather, life is just a feeble but belligerent attempt to contain it that way, in absence of anything particularly anchoring me down. So, with that said, when I started at UCA, working that is, only a few years had passed since my studying there, and many familiar tutors' faces continued their stint well into my return. For some, I have to admit, I couldn't shake off some cautious Pavlovian response in their presence, not differentiating from when I was a stoned, anxious teenager to a then restless, caffeinated, and anxious adult with a job. That being said, most of the tutors I had on my BTEC had left a positive impression. Most, and while I want to be fair and diplomatic in acknowledging that even the more divisive tutors who I experienced and observed as a student and as staff myself still have their base of enthusiastic supporters and clearly rub off well on certain people. I really missed my favourable CAIAD UCA tutors when studying in Brighton, which had some good stuff for sure, but the whole experience threw me down a different avenue of thinking that, in reflection, convoluted my creative process to constant conceptual delusion rather than refine any craft as I had hoped. I will greatly miss working with many UCA tutors, some who have already left a while back, others still there. I was somewhat talked out of taking a PGCE many years back, for better or worse. Going into the details there might be murky territory, so I won't. Skipping that whole matter, I ended up doing an MA in fine art, which again is a reflection for another time, but I can't stress how much I would love to do an MA again, with the benefit of better personal circumstance than I had at that time. I had been keen on pursuing tutoring for a while. I remember in the early days seeing graduate teaching assistants, thinking I'd not long since graduated at that point. I would have loved to do that. And when I asked any of them how they came to be GTAs, they all told me that they were just asked one day while supporting students in the same role as me. In reflection, although I may have come across to tutors as overly passive at times, I was advocating individual students and never really got the opportunity to demonstrate myself through a different discipline like tutoring work. I had run lessons at another school I'd worked at, but when those GTAs told me that they were just asked to do it. My addled and ruminating thoughts just left me in bitterness for not ever being asked or offered myself. In reflection, I should have just put myself forward, rather than succumb to my own reserved bitterness. That to me illustrates a failure at the time to advocate myself, while conversely, as an LSA, also having to advocate those other people. I think that what this boils down to is a broader experience, is how I tend to persist in life, with the best self determination as possible, awaiting signals of external validation, so I might then be able to openly advocate myself rather than restlessly doing it in the background as I did, waiting for some ethereal symbolic day when the universe presents enough gold stickers to warrant taking those valuable risks of rejection. Honestly, now I come to think of it, I wish I'd taken a few more psychedelics at that point in my life. A couple of deep altered states away from the adjacent culture of hedonism might have shaken off these limiting self delusions. Hedonism, by the way, I mean as in previously, not something I was doing at that time at all. So, yes, it might have shaken off these limiting self delusions without any external factors explicitly telling me to do so. But I was already consuming a lot of online self help guru content at that time, some of which was more beneficial than others. Yet I remain transfixed on a distant, abstract outcome of success, where all happiness and inner peace would reside, rendering the present as some vastly inconvenient thing that I had to aggressively tune out with more X, Y, and Z. I'm compelled to say I neither condone or condemn the use of psychedelics. I make these decisions to reflect openly, but working in education so many years, there is a cautious impartiality I've kept in mind when needed, as I know the radically different ways people can interpret such things. I do have some faith in individuals to work on their own critical thinking and judgment in a nuanced society, blah, blah, blah. But it should at least be obvious by now, I have no inclination towards chronic drug use and abuse. If I did, I probably wouldn't be writing a fucking journal. Unless I was snorting cocaine, maybe, but you need only glance at my payslips to know I couldn't afford that sort of habit if I wanted to. I did say this exercise of writing will tend to some self-analysis. 13 years of my life is basically just that. It's impossible to talk about an entity like where I have worked that long without it basically being about me. To end this section on one more positive note, the last thing to say of that 2012 to 2018 period is being around artists and an art curriculum really helped gain deeper insights and techniques of my own art practice, having graduated from my BA long before. Far more it helped with this, and far more I got out of this from just doing my BA. It was also instrumental in doing my MA in fine art there, which was more accessible given the staff discount on course fees and other perks like Terry, which is a hilarious pun if I do say so, lost on anyone not familiar with UCA, rest assured, ha ha ha, very droll. It was during this stage that the then staff cuts were announced to terminate the LSA roles, in place of a smaller number of inclusion assistant roles, which brings me to the second chapter before my conclusion. Chapter 2, Inclusion Assistant and Disability and Inclusion Advisor. As my MA drew to a close, the first chapter of significant cuts started playing out. The LSA roles were phased out in place of a much smaller group of inclusion assistant roles. After we were offered redundancy pay, I applied for the role of both inclusion mentor and inclusion assistant. The mentor role looked a bit more interesting, slightly better pay, and I didn't get that. Interestingly, as it transpired, those mentor roles already phased themselves out a few years ago. I like to think, in my own belligerent way, that wouldn't have happened if I had the job. But much as I like to indulge in smug bastard thoughts, at the end of the day, my IA inclusion assistant application was successful, and it is safe to say those contracts covered a lot of different and sometimes unexpected things. Generally, I think our team numbers ranged from 4 to 5 over the course of this job's creation, up to its very recent termination. As with most staff cuts and restructuring, the general gist is dissolve the old roles, replace them with fewer roles at a very slight increase of pay, maybe. That will then cover much more responsibilities to compensate for the lack of hands on deck, along with covering many more students in a more appointment-based model. There is the inevitable massive surge in admin, something which, as a workflow, has evolved somewhat over the years through trial and error, especially having to navigate some shamefully outdated admin systems, namely SITs, which ought to have been decommissioned last millennium. Other unnecessary admin obstacles is my UCA, not so much the website itself, but the complete lack of any standardised way in which tutors actually used it, if they are tutors with the inclination to use it much at all. Because why on earth might we, having to support students across different courses, find it useful, dare I say pretty fucking essential, to have quick and easy access to course information, including but not limited to what our students are supposed to be doing and when they're supposed to be doing it. It's not as if a large faction of our caseload need a lot of help understanding some instructions, and when they come to us in a panic at short notice, saying they don't know what they are supposed to be doing, it might be conducive for me to access the information immediately, rather than scouring the campus trying to find the tutors who may or may not be there, and probably resort to a string of email inquiries just to confirm information which isn't where it's supposed to fucking be. For the record, some courses and some tutors are very much on it and do a great job. So along with the increased caseload, having to overcompensate for the apparent ineptitude or a few key stragglers, the cryptically different way different courses like to hide the relevant information on the MyUCA area if they get round to uploading it at all, the shamefully flawed admin resources that make mundane tasks take many times longer than needed, the significant surge in mental health crises amongst the supported cohort, and the many other issues my colleagues and I have encountered before. The role, at least at peak times of the year, spreads itself across many different departments, and in desperate attempt to make something a little more streamlined, weaves around all these specific and unique pre-existing flaws like a contortionist act. To be clear, the majority of people working in said departments go above and beyond. It only takes a select few absent-minded folk, some short-sighted bureaucracy and Paleolithic software to derail a cohesive system. It is therefore ironic, I feel, that the recent technological shift, the AI, assistive tech and user-friendly interfaces that are standard parts of life for most of us now, could not have been implemented sooner to make the tedious tasks faster and more efficient, keep everyone on the same page with ease, and enable people like us to spend more front-facing time with the students, in the timeless and traditional manner that humans tend to connect and help each other. Yet, here we are, with a huge number of front-facing staff making students feel seen and valued, all now facing redundancy. AI and technology should have been the best thing to have happened to front-facing jobs, given that it can pick up the slack on all the mundane tedium that stands constantly in the way of being an actual person. The only jobs AI is the enemy of is the really shit ones that nobody liked doing in the first place. It is the short-sightedness of individuals who use sentiments of technological advances to excuse less human interaction. Anyway, though it feels like that's where things went, There was, of course, an interesting stage of reflection during the pandemic lockdowns. My memory is rusty. In the 2 years leading up to the first lockdown, my stress levels kept creeping up. Anxiety seemed to be an all-time high, but I was still in denial that I had such problems at all, trying to fake confidence where I could, in the hopes a fake it till you make it effect brainwashed me into a calm state of personal success. While my mind was, in part due to the subject matter of the job, interested in all things health and well-being, I was still transfixed on the belief that life was hostile, a bit shit, and all I need is a bit more hard work and innovation to reach a point of eventual happiness. I may have understood conceptually the value of being present, but tuning out the bad thoughts just seemed like a temporary means to get to where I wanted to go. And that temporary means of tuning out my own unhappiness just so happened to drag on for years, while this abstract goal of self-fulfillment grew more elusive. The pandemic seemed to kick in right as I was nearing a breaking point. I don't know what that breaking point would have looked like, but when the world grounded to a halt, so too, perversely, did my problems. I suppose the fact that it took a historical global pandemic to bring me any sense of personal inner peace was the first clear sign some of my problems were internal, or at least had become. But to that end, as the job became remote, I personally flourished for a time. The lockdown forced everyone, staff and students, to cohere to a reliable schedule, and so with a predictable routine in place and 3 monitors set up at home, it had never been easier to keep track of everything. It was only as the pandemic phased out and things got back to normal on campus, the anxiety and internal disorder kicked back in, and soon after a partially bad burnout and subsequent low point, I finally accepted something was wrong. My GP offered me SSRIs. I tried herbal supplements first, and since then life has been an ongoing chemistry experiment, alternating between different nootropic medications while they periodically work well, then stop working at all. The times they worked well did allow me to reassess how I handle tasks at UCA. So even when things got bad again, I had a better system to fall back on. But damn, it was frustrating when you sail through some days with borderline euphoria only to have subsequent days where seemingly mundane tasks or interactions feel like an ordeal. It did, however, offer me some newfound insight and empathy with many students grappling with medications and unpredictable crashes in mood. I started noticing ADHD and autistic similarities where I didn't before, as did my GP. And hearing more of students' experiences really opened my eyes to that. My attention span had always been shit. At least that's one take on it. Another would be that there's too many boring and tedious people in the world who don't know how to communicate in an engaging way. Both is probably true, but I always ruled out ADHD because the impulsive guys I knew who had it acted very differently to me. I can relate to all the internal frenetic chaos, but my coping mechanisms have long since been to mask the fuck out of that with every ounce of energy in my body. Much less so as a child when I felt safe to just be me, but I guess the constant paranoia of giving off the wrong impression had conditioned the compulsion to present a calm, reserved demeanour so as to not confuse, upset or alienate people. There could be autism, there could be other things. All I know on paper is dyslexia and dyspraxia. The rest I don't at the time of writing know, but I'd still like to, because my mind isn't particularly transparent, even to me. Why else would I type and type and type? Most people seem to just get drunk or have a wank and then just move on to life's next thing. I can't shake the messy fucking thoughts off. At many different junctions, I assessed internal progression there was the aforementioned PGCE, which by the final quarter of this 13-year stretch, I developed an aversion to revisiting, partly due to the past 2 years of long COVID or the elusive mental health problems that preceded it, but in fact largely due to speaking to people on said courses. And people who'd done said course, not only did it sound like a spectacular ball ache of a commitment to do, but it didn't seem to promise a significantly better life. Better pay, yes, but I don't think I had the inclination to attempt to park all those extra weekly problems to solve when I was finding it hard enough to find the focus, time and energy to keep my art practice going as it was, and that was with a part-time job. I often wondered if working a job with less pay but more hours and much less mental burnout would actually free up more bandwidth to pursue things that gave life a deeper element of purpose and satisfaction. Given my recent redundancy, I may well find out before the year draws to a close, but I must recognise that the fear of sacrificing free time was always an obstacle in career progression, given how hard it was to organise my frenetic mind with the time I already had. That being said, for a brief time I had the pleasure of working at the Steiner School outside of town before the place sadly closed due to funding issues. By this point, I'd already explored training and counselling skills, taking a level 2 course, then freezing that progression indefinitely after a year of home moving stuff and other adjacent matters to tend to. But the 1 day a week at said school, along with my normal hours at UCA, worked surprisingly well. And while the internal progression routes available within UCA at that point all looked like a life of soul-crushing administrative tedium, the Steiner School offered prospects of internal progression that really appealed, with integrating myself into a healthier work environment, lots of outdoors, enthusiastic children, and barely a laptop in sight. Not that I don't like laptops, but there's too many of them. What I think is really interesting is how, despite the first signs of long COVID starting to kick in around this time, that 1 day a week at the school was incredibly physically demanding. A long bike ride commute over steep hills at the crack of dawn, plus a whole day of keeping up with the children, yet the grim effects of increasing brain fog and fatigue that became prevalent across the rest of the week at UCA and at home was scarcely there on those Thursdays. The stress triggers for this viral inflammation came almost solely, it seemed, from an overload of information. Well, that's internal and external and all that crap. Anyway, while feeling generally untethered from the rest of the world. So it seemed from an overload of information, while feeling generally untethered from the rest of the world, that grievance consumed most of my work days as well as my days off. This was almost 2 years ago. Thankfully, the long COVID symptoms have improved, though nowhere near as much as I'd like. 2 years is a bloody long time to have unpredictable basic mental functions. But the general take home from what that experience demonstrated is that regular connections with people, doing hands-on activities, outdoors if possible, is good for my health. Who could have predicted that? And to that end, when it comes to professional progression, ultimately, I'm willing to sacrifice most things for creative success, but would gladly continue paying the bills by doing a variation of what I've been doing for ages. So long as the process is streamlined and front-facing, I am pleased to say that overall, the courses I've worked on this last year at UCA has been streamlined. It's been much easier to access and keep track of essential information and support the students with confidence, which you could say is tragically ironic, but I've made my peace and off to live in the woods until I grow some antlers. Touching briefly on the counselling, we signposted students and liaise with counsellors at UCA frequently. The inevitable nature of the job and declining mental health in our cohort meant people would disclose any and everything a person in that situation would disclose. This is challenging, but was genuinely the most rewarding part of the job for me. At no point did my interactions at work feel more significant and meaningful, and important as did my responsibilities in how to respond. The point has been made many times, we are not professionals in mental health. We get some training modules to cover the essential information and signpost those matters constantly. It's still an inescapable part of the nature of the job to have become as familiar with these matters as the wellbeing staff often are. But counselling as a profession is incidentally somewhat of a ball ache to learn. I would need to spend over £5,000 on a level 4 counselling qualification so I can work for twice the hourly rate as a DSA mentor, doing what is, by all accounts of students I've heard from, a crapper version of the job that I already did. I'm sure there are many excellent DSA mentors out there. One just recognises the disparity between first-hand skills, qualifications and reputation that aren't treated as holistically as someone between jobs like myself would hope that they do. Returning one last time to my time at UCA, because that was the point I recall, I'll try to be critical. Here are a few things I definitely sucked at least for a time, barring only my own self-confidence, which I've touched upon enough. 1. Attention span. Making notes from briefings and lectures, my attention span betrayed me a lot. I'm partially going to blame some tutors for this, because the good tutors would, by their nature, give clear, more succinct information. One tutor I liked a lot did give briefs that were long, vague and ambiguous, but it didn't really matter with them. He was the kind of guy you could just smile and go with the flow. Another tutor would spend up to hours giving instructions, taking so many tangents for examples and suggestions and labouring every minute point that the overall instructions were lost in mental fatigue. I'm not a qualified tutor, and as I've said before, some tutors work well for different people. But I can say this with confidence. There is one very simple key to giving an effective briefing, and the clue is in the name. I was too light on some of the earlier students. I relied too much on politeness. I could have at times laboured the point to some students to actually get on with the work in as constructive way as possible. It took me a while, especially with some autistic students, to get past my own etiquette and polite restraint when some people did not take the series of polite hints that I was putting out. I can't think of any more personal flaws right now. I am sure there are lots, but they are all going to cause me to trail off too much. And maybe that is the key flaw. I mean, if anyone has read or listened this far in, then I'll state for the record, I've probably been a twat, and I can get very defensive if I feel like I'm being perceived or represented inaccurately. But with that impulse, I've no doubt fallen into twat territory at times while consumed in my own discontent. I can only assure you that I really am mindful of spending less time as a twat now. I think that concludes about everything I'm currently able to say, at least into the public domain. I never said it was going to be concise, unless I did and I can't remember saying that, in which case sorry about that. I hope this has some external value. But I have to make these long reflections public domain because it forces me to think more clearly. Writing a personal diary sounds like hell. There's no closure or catharsis in talking to myself. I talk to myself all the fucking time and it does my head in. So for the record, I am indebted to many people I've worked with at UCA. While I've grappled with my own complications in life, my time getting to work in such a stimulating and sometimes inspiring environment gave me a more nuanced outlook on life than a generic office job might have. Probably for better and worse, but it certainly shows in my recent job hunting how different work and career paths define us all in more ways than we would often like them to. I guess with any closure I have on that long life chapter, I have nothing to add regarding the future. It's in flux more so than normal. And I must be at some peace with that because I have nothing more to say right now. Goodbye, UCA, and goodbye, people generally who are listening to this.